I've decided to do a mini series where I interview healthcare professionals to teach parents how they form part of an integral team to help your child with their nutritional problems, be it emotional, physical, or functional. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing an occupational therapist. Her name is Marlies. She studied at the University of Stellenbosch and she's trained in sensory integration as well as SOS. If you want to get help for your child and you don't know where to begin, you're more than welcome to contact me. I will leave my contact details in the description below. And then I will also leave Marlise's contact details there if you'd like to book an appointment with her to help your child become the best that they can be. Because I really do believe children are the next generation and we need to invest in them so they can make a big change in the world. And as always, please like the video. And if you'd like to follow along on this mini series and find out the next healthcare professional that I'm going to interview, hit that subscription button and then stay tuned. Welcome, Marlies, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me and just have a little conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, so it's always interesting for me to ask people why they chose to work with children because I know there are quite a few people that don't really, they don't choose to work with children because not they I think they're scared they will hurt them because they're so fragile. So they rather work with the adult population. But why did you decide to work with this specific population?
So I think initially when I was considering occupational therapy as a career, my first exposure to occupational therapy was actually my brothers having attended OT, and it always seemed like a lot of fun. And they just got to play with the play auntie and would get a sticker or a small little CD afterwards for their hard work. And I was like, this doesn't seem like hard work because they're playing games and they're swinging on swings and all of these fun things. Um, but I think for me, when I first got into occupational therapy, I was a student, like a lot of the fields really, really interested me. But I think I sort of saw with school-based occupational therapy and especially working with a pediatric population, it's just something that came a little bit easier to me. And I think it clicked. And I think one of the big things was it was really fun for me. Like I also enjoyed playing and crawling around and climbing on the swings. And yeah, I think also maybe I just still love toys and I'm a little bit of a kid at heart. So that also makes it a little bit easier.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yes, because I think yes, it takes a special person to work with them because you need to connect with them on a certain
Mm.
level so they actually, will do what you ask them to do. So you said you're SOS trained, and I know a few of the viewers will be thinking, okay, SOS, save our souls. And yes, I think parents sometimes do feel like, oh, save our souls, our child's not eating, we don't know what's going on. Um, so what does SOS stand for and what does it entail?
So the SOS approach to feeding stands for the sequential oral sensory approach. It was developed largely by Dr. Kay Toomey within her clinical work, as well as her working with a lot of different disciplines. So I think she's a psychologist by training, but she worked a lot with occupational therapists, speech therapists, dietitians, yeah, just a broad spectrum of clinicians, and developed this approach specifically for children with feeding difficulties. So this is more than our average picky eater. These are usually children with a very severe limited diet, and or any children that are really struggling to even transition off of feeding tubes. Just because of oral motor skills, sensory processing skills, feeding skills just in general. So the SOS approach is a holistic approach. It's transdisciplinary, and it really works on addressing those feeding skills. So it looks at a little bit of everything to ensure that the child is able to get to a place where they have a more varied diet.
Okay, that's really cool because I remember, I don't know when, but I came across this training and I was really interested in this. And I know in America, being a dietitian, it all works a bit differently. And there they can actually do the training and, do it in practice and all. But I don't think, in South Africa you can do that. It's more like an OT focused thing. So,
Yeah, so I within South Africa, I know there are some speech therapists trained, there are some occupational therapists trained. I do believe there are some dietitians that may have done the training at some point. But with how the HPCSA is structured, the way we can offer this type of therapy is a little bit limited. So they oftentimes recommend, ideally, we would set up a feeding clinic, which would be
ah,
great in my mind,
always.
where all of these, so it within that, they would be feeding groups, and whilst the child is receiving feeding therapy with one or two therapists, the parents are receiving parent education from another therapist.
That'll be great.
And within that structure, they sort of address sort of every side. Within South Africa, I often refer to other therapists and other dietitians and clinicians and things like that as I need their support as well. But it is challenging because ideally we would want a sort of one-stop shop for a child.
No, definitely. So can you describe your role as an occupational therapist working with children and the types of challenges that you help children overcome?
Okay. So as a pediatric occupational therapist, I primarily work with children from 0 to about 13 would be the oldest I see
Oh,
personally.
yeah.
Um, and I address a bunch of different challenges, anything from sensory processing challenges, so children that are oversensitive or undersensitive to sensory input. So that might be the child that gets very irritated by wearing clothing, or the child that gets very overstimulated by maybe loud noises.
Mhm.
And yeah, that is also a spectrum within itself. We also work with children in terms of um, developmental delays in gross motor skills, fine motor skills. Oftentimes, what a lot of people will hear from teachers is that, oh, the occupational therapist will work on the handwriting and the pencil grip, which is true, but we work on so much more as well. And then also visual perceptual skills that can affect a child's scholastic abilities. And then I personally really, really love working with feeding. That is a big passion of mine, which is why I pursued these further trainings. And uh, primarily within that space, I will work with children who are picky eaters, to the point where it's becoming a problem. They have a very limited diet. It's affecting how they might gain weight, grow, and just take part in their daily activities. It's starting to affect that. So then that's when I would step in. And depending on the child and the parent, that might look a little bit different for each child. But then we work together to build the skills necessary so that the child can enjoy a varied diet.
That's really cool because I don't think a lot of parents or anyone really understand what occupational therapist does, especially in terms of child nutrition, as not just, oh, okay, the doctor or the dietitian, but there is help for children, even when you think, oh, no, no one can help me. There is really.
Mm.
So that's really cool.
And I think
Okay.
I think on that is also just that within the feeding field is relatively new. I think it was only in last year that there was an ICD-10 code established for pediatric feeding difficulties. So there's still a lot of work to be done. We still need more trained therapists in this area as we see that feeding is becoming a bigger issue. More and more people are struggling with it. So
Oh,
yeah.
but that is great to know that there is help. I think you mentioned it now, we touched on it a bit, but for children with sensory processing issues, how do food and the texture, taste, and smell play a role in therapy?
Sensory processing is just how our body makes sense of the world around us, how we make sense of what we're touching, what we're feeling, what we're smelling, what we're hearing. Our body is processes all of that information and then it produces appropriate outputs. Now, for our children that are oversensitive, usually that struggle with sensory processing to touch or to textures or to smell, feeding or eating in general can be quite a challenging activity. So because it's such an overwhelming amount of input, their bodies might feel overwhelmed, especially if there's differences then to what they're expecting in terms of food texture. So imagine, like, I think my best example of that would be something like a blueberry. From a whole tub of blueberries, one blueberry will be nice and sweet and juicy, and the next one might be a little bit tart
Oh,
and a little
yes.
bit sour.
I've had that.
You don't know what to expect. So if you know your body is already overreacting to a lot of input like this,
Mm.
it can be really challenging if you don't know what to eat. So then I'd rather just avoid the food because I don't know what to expect. I don't know if I'm gonna when I put this in my mouth, I don't know what's gonna happen. So I rather just avoid. And they usually tend to stick to the bland foods, the white foods, as we say, the predictable pastas and breads and things that are the same every time, because that's easier for their body to manage. But within that, because each child is so unique and the way we interpret sensory information is so unique, we'll see a lot of variation between that as well. For some kids, they really enjoy crunchy things. For other kids, maybe because of poor oral motor skills, they might avoid harder table foods or crunchy things and stick to soft purees and mashes. So in general, because food is such a sensory experience, when I'm struggling to process sensory information accurately, eating is going to be challenging.
Oh, shame. And we have to eat like minimum 3 times a day, especially for them
Mm,
growing and you're being so busy. Oh, and then I think like the fast food chains and all of those chains and all of those places, like they have a formula for the food to look the same, to taste the same every single time.
mm.
And do you think maybe that's why people gravitate to junk food because it's so predictable?
Absolutely. I think in general, what I've noticed across with my parents and the kids I see is that they tend to gravitate to things that are going to be predictable and the same every time. And unfortunately, with a lot of our fruits and veggies and the food, even as cook from, like, even if it's raw meats and stuff, it's difficult to get the exact same texture, the exact same taste every time
Oh,
without the big industrialization process. So in the end, it is easier to stick to ultra processed and fast foods just because of the sameness. But then that brings a whole other host of other nutritional challenges, as you've probably encountered
yeah.
in your practice.
Shame, but have you then found, because of this poor diet, that it influences a child's like, ability to focus, regulate their emotions, or participate in therapy sessions?
So I think it's one of the first principles they sort of teach us when we study occupational therapy is when testing a child or working with a patient, we need to remind ourselves that depending on depending on their diet, that might influence their performance. If a child hasn't eaten the day, they are going to be tired. They're not going to give their best. Also, if, yeah, depending on just a child's diet in general, certain nutritional deficiencies, and I think you'd be able to comment really better on exactly what influences what, but that can affect energy levels. It can affect cognitive function and just their ability to build new skills. I think for me, the easiest example just to flag there is something as simple as iron levels. A
Oh,
child who's not eating not getting sufficient iron within their diet might become anemic, might be lethargic, might struggle with all of these different things, and that's gonna influence their ability to focus and to concentrate.
and if, like, let's say a child's not eating enough protein or so, the muscles are underdeveloped, that will probably
Mm,
also influence a lot of the fine motor skills and, yeah, actually all the motor and functional.
absolutely. Oftentimes what we find is that these problems don't sort of happen in isolation, which is why I really enjoy the SOS approach because it is so holistic. So children they're because of sensory processing difficulties, they might have a limited diet, but this limited diet is in turn affecting their oral motor skills and then that this can lead to difficulty with speech production. Like nothing
Yeah.
sort of happens in isolation in the body. All of these things tend to connect to each other and build on top of each other. And in general, a lot of our problem feelers are not eating enough energy-dense food, which often leads to them being more lethargic, not being able to build skills and function the way we would expect them to function.
Shame, but like I said, I'm so grateful that there are so many people in the health profession that can actually help with that.
Mm.
If we can just make more people aware of it. But have you encountered any like misconceptions with regards to nutrition when you from the parents' side?
Yeah, I think the first one I definitely encounter with an OT practice is this idea that sugary foods leads to a hyperactivity. Um, Although we know that from research that isn't true. Sugar, like any other carbohydrate, will give us a burst of energy, but
Yeah.
often children's levels of energy can also be influenced by their sensory processing, just their excitement and their temperament. If they are at a birthday party, they are going to be excited. There is going to be a lot more energy. So I think that's sort of the first thing that parents often try to control a child's activity levels by what they're but why by the what they're taking in, and that definitely contributes, but it isn't the only thing that's going to have an influence there. And then the other one I do also just come across a lot is this idea that maybe taking a gummy multivitamin or in the morning will replace the fact that they're not eating veg and
Mhm.
fruit throughout the day. And yeah, I mean, I think here you would be able to tell us also a little bit, a bit more.
Yes.
But a supplement isn't a replacement for a rich and varied diet. It
Definitely
can
not.
help, but it's, yeah, at the end of the day, what we would want is children to have a balanced, well-rounded diet.
And I mean, it is difficult because children are picky, and there's a picky stage that they go through, and not you can't really solve it with a multivitamin, especially certain multivitamins. It's just there to make you feel better about yourself, but it doesn't really contribute a lot to the child's nutrition in any way, shape, or form. And then you just end up with more sugar in their diet, unfortunately. And I think also just with the sugar, with ADHD and all of that, that sugar spike, because obviously sweets, it doesn't have any fiber or anything in it, so it will not
Mm.
uh, delay that increase in sugar spike. So when you do eat the food, it's just going to spike quickly and very steeply, and then that's where the sugar, I mean, the hyperactivity comes in. So yeah, can't blame the child for it. It's yeah, like we said, what they eat. um, so we know that when we work together as a multidisciplinary team, we'll achieve better results. And you did mention that you do refer to people and dietitians and so on. So when would you feel, to being a dietitian, when would you feel to refer to a dietitian in some cases?
So within my intake process and when I'm evaluating the child, I always ask about eating habits. How do their eating habits look like? What are they getting in? Is it balanced? Is it well-rounded? And usually if there are some red flags popping up there, then I refer. Within my feeding cases, particularly, I always actually make a point of it to refer to a dietitian, because even when a child has a limited diet, the dietitian, you guys always have really creative ideas of how we can use what they already are eating or are tolerating and create food that has high calories that will give them the energy they need to build muscle and to concentrate, and also really assist with the supplementation, how we can get those vitamins and minerals and all of those things in, even though when they have a limited diet, and we're working on expanding that. So that is always really, really helpful. And I think oftentimes parents think, oh, there's no point in going to a dietitian because they're going to tell me to eat things and my child's not going to eat that.
Yeah.
Um, that's a big misconception,
Oh,
because
definitely.
where the dietitian will work with the family and see what works for them. And I think that's sort of the biggest through line for any therapist working with children is that we want to ensure that whatever intervention we're giving is also beneficial to the family system as a whole. We don't want to create or we don't want to intervene in a way that creates tension and more stress at home because that's not going to be beneficial to anyone in the long run.
Yeah, no, definitely. Ah, but thank you so much for joining me. Just to answer a few questions, I really appreciate it and the knowledge that you have. It's amazing. And I really hope that the viewers also learned a thing or two, because I know I did. But yeah, thank you so much for helping our children, and I hope you all the best for the future. Does your child have a texture problem? Do they struggle to eat? Or is there any other sensory issues that they might have? Drop a comment below and let us know what your child might be struggling with, or even just what you have learned during this interview.